Welcome, everybody, to the Always Hope podcast, a production of Will Wood's Faith in Marriage. This is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I'm grateful to have you with us today for another amazing episode. Well, joining me on the podcast today is Danny Fitzpatrick, editor of the Joie de Vivre Journal. I'm not saying that right. I know I'm not saying that right. I'm trying. I had 10 years in New Orleans. I still can't pronounce things in French. I'm sorry. I'm trying. The Joie de Vivre Journal, the Joy of Living Journal, but we say it in English. Have Danny on the show to talk about the intertangled relationship between faith, tradition, art, and culture. We discuss how culture is an embodied religion, the importance of traditions, and the necessity of the creative process to move culture forward. We examine our modern fragmented culture and ask, who is pop culture really worshiping? And we proclaim the need to reclaim art as a contemplative exercise, not just a consumer-driven one. Danny also shares about the work that they're doing at the St. Louis the Ninth Art Society, which is helping to promote religious art in Southern Louisiana. Well, if you have any questions or thoughts about the show, please hit them up. Follow me on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. Or if you know that you have found this show particularly insightful or helpful, well, if you think that it'd be helpful to one other person, then please pass it along to that one individual. Well, thanks everybody for joining me. Let's get into this conversation with Danny Fitzpatrick. Danny Fitzpatrick, welcome to the Always Hope podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mario. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh man, pleasure is all mine. Great gift to have you come on the show. Thank you for taking the time. I know that you are full-time professor, teacher at Jesuit High School. So I guess I should throw a pocket J up. Not that anybody kind of knows what that means, is even watching. But my boys, of course, my oldest is a proud Jesuit alum. And my second son was there for his 8th grade year before we moved up here to Charlotte. So how's the year been for you? How's the teaching gig? How are things going back in New Orleans right now?
It's been great. I've been very happy to be back. As I mentioned to you earlier, I taught here for 3 years from 2013 to 16. I'm also an alum. So, and it's kind of been a part of my family for many, many years. So my grandfather on my mom's side grew up, he was the son of Sicilian immigrants here in New Orleans and grew up very, very poor and really wanted to have a great education. And he earned a scholarship to Jesuit and really considered that to be the turning point for his whole life. So that when he ultimately finished, after World War II, he finished his degree at Tulane, had an offer to go work for a Brazilian oil firm because he spoke Portuguese. Wow. But he said, no, I'm going back to Jesuit. I'm going to teach and coach there because I owe it to them. And he ended up founding his own private elementary schools.
Wow.
So
that's incredible. Okay, so hold on. So first thing, most people, like most part of the country, most people, I guess, in other parts of the country don't realize like the Jesuits like the Jesuit High School in New Orleans is like an institution. I mean, it was this senior class is the 150th graduating class of the high school. Like Gabriel went to school with kids who were like 5th, 6th generation. You're talking about like your great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father, you, like, it's not even a question that where your kids are going to go. I mean, like that type of like bedrock of like a family system and a culture. I mean, it's just like, it's hard to grasp. So like Isaac, who I said went to Jesuit his 8th grade year, but then this year the school he's at, is 10 years old. And he's like, that's cute, like, it's like,
right.
Like they're trying, but like, it doesn't have like the cachet of like something that's been around for 150 years. And so I think, like, what do you make of that? I mean, how did that shape you kind of growing up? How did that form your own kind of consciousness? Or I may have been thinking too deeply already about this, but like, what do you think about that as like having something like that that's existed for so long that is a part of the New Orleans culture? It's Catholic high schools and Jesuit versus Brother Martin. These things don't exist everywhere, but it's something particular to the culture of New Orleans. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is certainly a peculiarity of New Orleans that whenever anyone asks you, where'd you go to school? Which in most other places in the country would mean, what university did you go to? But here it's, what high school did you go to? And, that's kind of the first question everybody has for you. And you really do sort of glean a lot about someone from what school they went to here.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that, to me, as I get older and reflect on it more, I find it to be a really remarkable model of culture building in a lot
Mm,
of ways.
mm,
So, for instance, when Father Maisonneuve, who was the Jesuit who started this school back in 1847, he himself was afflicted by yellow fever and died. But the work proceeded, and similar things happened in the establishment of the Jesuit High School in Tampa in 1899.
mhm,
But there was a sense of commitment to a long range vision, to being prepared to engage in a work that would perhaps not be completed certainly not in Father Maisonneuve's lifetime. He never even had any students come to the school while he was still alive.
wow.
Um, but I think that's a big part of the work of Catholic culture is being ready to engage in projects that we won't see the conclusion of. I think it's something that for a lot of people, I know for myself, is very daunting because I want to do things that I'm going to see the results of,
Mm.
and I would prefer those results to be almost
Im-
instantaneous if
Immediate
possible,
and gratifying.
um, and involve very little suffering on my part.
Yeah.
But throughout the ages, the church has given such an example of being willing to engage in projects that we won't see come to fruition,
Mm.
and may never in some ways come to fruition. So, I mean, this Jesuit high school and the one in Tampa and many other Jesuit schools have been marvelously successful. But we can also think about someone like Saint Jean de Brebeuf, one of the North American
Hmm.
martyrs, who goes on mission, endures horrible situations, um, and engages in a work that in many ways has not left much of a mark. You can't go out and find cathedrals that are built in the sites where he lived and worked. Um, but yeah, to be here as part of the Jesuit tradition here at the school is sort of always kind of shaping the way that I start to think practically about, okay, how do we build culture and how do we combine faith and art in institutions and structures and in individual works that will hopefully, God willing, bear fruit in time.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Well, Danny, no, certainly, I really appreciate those insights. And so, what the audience doesn't know yet is that in addition to your work at uh, Jesuit High School, well, I guess they probably know this already because I would have already done the introduction, but you also work for the St. Louis and Ninth Art Society, which we'll talk about that towards the end of the episode here. But specifically, you're the editor of the journal, the Joie de Vivre Journal. I'm not saying that correct, the Joy of Living. I know that. But 10 years in New Orleans, still I couldn't pick up the French or the New Orleans version of French accent. So, but what you just stated is something that you wrote about in the journal. And so I'd love to hear more about this. Okay. So the thought of tradition and culture and the relationship between the two, it is fascinating. So I think this is great, even as we talk about kind of comparisons of like Jesuit high school versus the high school at Christ the King, which, listen, we're very grateful. Christ the King, not just very grateful, we're very happy. They're doing a wonderful job at the school. Isaac's thriving. He's making great friends. And so I can't say anything bad about Christ the King. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. But part of our discernment, certainly when we were moving, was how much did we need that kind of establishment, for lack of a better word,
Mm-hmm.
that Jesuit is that something that was fundamental to what we needed for our boys' kind of high school education. And as we made some of this sermon, it was like, as wonderful as that was, I mean, in the end, we didn't fully need it. What we needed is to make sure that the school was educating the boys well and guiding them well. But being there, I will say that we do miss the depth of that culture. And
Mm-hmm.
so like school pride, for example, is nowhere near what it was at Jesuit High School, or any of the schools in New Orleans. I keep mentioning Jesuits because you're there and because that was my, that's where my boys went, but any of the schools in New Orleans. And so it's interesting the way that you think about what you talked about, like the founding of both Jesuit New Orleans and Jesuit Tampa, but you also make a similar kind of statement in your article about people who are willing to commit themselves to the creation of some project that is going to outlive them, be it a parent, and a child. But even when it comes to like art projects, like those who created the great cathedrals, most of them didn't see it, to its completion. And so I guess my question here is, what is that relationship between tradition and culture, and how does tradition shape culture? How does culture shape tradition? And if you're in kind of a new establishment like like what we're at with Christ the King, part of what I feel is the gift that we can bring to the school actually is bringing a lot that we have in our experience from New Orleans and trying to bring about greater school spirit and replicating some of those things. Obviously, you can't replicate 175 years. That's just something that's transferable. But there are some things that do work very well in that kind of culture of high school, not just sports, but high school kind of pride and identification. That's part of the New Orleans kind of experience, and try and translate some of that. We want to be able to help that. So I guess I don't even know what I'm talking about here, but what do you think about like that sense of like tradition, about culture, about committing yourself to something that pre-exists you, or committing yourself to something that's going to outdate you? How do those different kind of things relate as you see them?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and such a difficult one to even sort of start to think about and
to
formulate.
As I had a hard time formulating it as it was trying to come out of my mouth.
So I think perhaps it's useful to think about it in terms of salvation history in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start to think about the relationship between tradition and culture, I think one of the sort of obvious keys that jumps out to me is an understanding of tradition in sort of a literal sense of handing something on,
mm-hmm.
passing something down. And so, I mean, looking at the history of Israel, for instance, going back as far as Abraham, Abraham in some ways is this really interesting figure with respect to this question, and that he is on a human level, almost totally breaking from the culture in which he has grown up. When the Lord calls him out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and he goes to this distant land and is basically starting a new culture in his way.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in his case, I think is only possible because of the relationship he has with God. That basically God is handing down to him this new approach to relationship with God, which then Abraham is going to begin to instantiate by, basically, like we see all these examples in that early period of the Old Testament of these fathers going out, right, and digging wells and establishing altars.
Mm-hmm.
So we see that with Abraham, where he digs wells, he builds altars at places where he's had particular encounters with God. And through that process of listening to God and then allowing that voice of the Lord to form what we do in our encounters with the surrounding culture and our encounters with the landscape, we begin to establish the sort of own more human culture that is proceeding from, I think ultimately what we could maybe call the culture of the Trinity, which is always looking to the other, delighting in the other, seeing oneself in the other, and rejoicing in that shared relationship.
So going back to like Abraham, and you're saying, it's interesting you start there, because you're right. Like he's called and he's uprooted from his personal culture, but then he becomes the bedrock of this new culture. Like he becomes the foundation of the Jewish people, and then us, the Christians. Well, all the monotheistic religions have a tie back to Abraham, and so he becomes the bedrock for something new. And so right there it's an interesting kind of I guess proposal that you're making, which is to say that we're called out of something to establish something, yet that's something that we're establishing has already existed when you go obviously back all the way to like, we can elevate it to the level of the Trinity like you did, but there's but there's something like human about wanting to create. And there's something human about wanting to be part of something that's bigger than us. And sometimes the things that we create end up being something bigger than us, but sometimes the things that we create, we just want to be part of what is already there. So like your grandfather, like you said, had the opportunity to go to Brazil to work for an oil company, but he said, no, I want to continue this tradition and pay this forward. The great gift that the Jesuit education gave to me, I want to dedicate my life to that. And so there's a discernment that he went through to be able to kind of stay part of the tradition or to establish something new. And I think in times in our lives, it feels like we're always kind of vacillating between moments of wanting to create something new that can live beyond us, or wanting to be part of something that already pre-exists us. And there's a tension that's there. Now, both of that, obviously, we can elevate that to the Trinity, of course, because obviously God is both ever ancient, ever new, the Alpha, the Omega, et cetera, all the above. But even in our own hearts at the experiential level, we wrestle with that.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe we especially wrestle with that today, just in that it seems like there are just so many possibilities now, that for a great deal of history, I suppose, for most people, it was fairly easy. And you see this still a lot in a place like New Orleans, where people do tend to stick around and put down roots and stay in one place for a long time. But it's just so easy now, if you want, on some level, to go and just go just about anywhere in the world and try to establish something new. So I think, yeah, there's always that tension within us. And I think it's also a critical tension that needs to be there sort of at the heart of the life of the church. Because, of course, we're not, we're all called to go out to all the world, and not remain in one place. The apostles can't just remain in Jerusalem. They immediately start to go out,
Right.
very, very far. And so, yeah, there is that tension that I think is critical to the development of culture and to the development of a tradition, that goes from one place and is handed down to another and takes on characteristics of the new and incorporates them and gives new life to them.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you define culture then?
So Dr. Haddad, Jordan Haddad, who's the founder of the St. Louis IX Art Society and president of Joie de Vivre, has a really nice article in our first issue on culture as embodied religion, which to me is a very helpful definition. That culture is always, on some level, an act of worship. Now, of course, especially when we think about like popular culture, American culture, it's very easy to think of many examples that seem to be completely antithetical to worship. But I think, kind of as you say, we have this innate human drive to create things, which seems to be tied up with our innate desire to worship as well. So to me, that seems to be the most helpful definition, is that culture is embodied religion, an act of somehow trying to impress our desire for God upon the material world around us.
So how does Lady Gaga fit into that definition? And I'm not picking on Lady Gaga. I'm just trying to grab a pop culture reference, in that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think with someone like Lady Gaga, and I've not contemplated her works.
I'm not saying her specifically. I mean Kim Kardashian. I'm saying any celebrity, the celebrity culture, pop stars, or that. How does? Are you saying? I mean, when we talk about art in terms of creation, yes, is that the relationship that you're making? I mean, or are you saying that all culture is trying to? Because when we think of religious activities, we're talking about a creed, a common sense of belief. We're speaking about the qualities of this, and tell me what you're right or wrong. If I'm right or wrong here, we talk about creed. There's a set of belief system. There's a way of behavior. There's a morality that's involved in that.
Right.
There is an ideal that we aspire to as well. That's part of that. The things that we worship, the things that we believe are going to give us that greatest value and guide us towards our best version. Those things are you saying that those things are religious, whether they're kind of theistic or not? Is that kind of what you and what Jordan's kind of saying, is that set of behaviors is what we would call kind of religious activity, and that is how all culture kind of centers around those behaviors, and how each culture takes those things and applies them or runs with them or creates kind of new methods in that. But more or less, that's what a group of people are trying to do. Is that what you're saying, or am I off on that? What
Yeah,
do you
I
think?
think I think to some degree. So I mean, I would say in a Lady Gaga, Kim Kardashian culture, um, I think there is. I think all of those elements of religion are in some way present. So I mean, what could we say is the creed of modern American pop culture?
Oh, sure.
I think in some ways we could get down to basically a statement that I believe that I am God on some
Hmm.
level,
Hmm.
and that I am free to fashion myself in whatever image after whatever likeness I see fit,
Hmm.
and that and we could try to elaborate that more if we
Sure.
wanted to. But I think sort of all those elements of religion are present even in what seems to be a very a-religious culture like ours, in the sense that I think ultimately at the end of the day, so much of current culture has to do with an attempted divinization of the self,
Hmm. Hmm.
or a sort of drive toward ultimate autonomy,
Hmm.
where I can, in dispensing with God altogether,
Hmm.
effectively raise myself up as my own God.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with that. We live in kind of um, 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 a techno-Pelagianism, like it's like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
through the advances of technology, I can do what I want now. And I mean, we've accomplished a lot, obviously, as a society, and we're very capable
Yes.
of curing a lot of diseases, and we've created a lot of great opportunities for people to be able to make money and be self-sufficient, which is wonderful. Obviously, we're not saying we're against that, but there, of course, is always a line where we elevate the self at the expense of God and put ourselves at the center of all of creation, and
Right.
think that we can, through our own capacities, save ourselves. And I definitely believe that that would be a creed that is articulated verbally or non-verbally. That
Sure.
certainly is a belief system that's there. When people talk about, like, I believe in science, I was like, what does that mean? You don't believe. How do you believe science? What is science? Science is nothing. Like, it's just observation. Like, that's not a belief system, but that's just an observation that people have, and it's more than that. Obviously, I believe in the scientific method too, but just saying that, like, there's something more to that. So let's kind of bring this back down a little bit, okay? So
Sure.
back to this conversation of, like, the relationship between tradition and culture. We talk about, like, starting new things, and how we have this drive for that, but we also have a drive to be part of something, larger than us, the drive to be part of something that predates us. Um, I think you're kind of hinting at this with regards to New Orleans, where the culture is so clear, and it's clear with in the fall, everybody's watching Saints games. In the Mardi Gras season, everybody's at parades. In the springtime, everybody's having crawfish boils on Fridays when they're not supposed to, even though it's Lent. And every Sunday, we hear the priest say, "Stop having crawfish boils on Friday. It's not meat, but hey, it defeats the purpose." But everybody still does it anyways. Every summer, people are having battles about what their favorite snowball stand is, and then the cycle
Yes.
repeats. And it's very clear in terms of what the culture is. But thinking about something like the internet, which has, in social media, it has created kind of these bracketed culture, so to speak. It's like, and you hear commentators talk about, like, the death of the monoculture. When, like, the 70s, there's a very clear kind of definition of what the 70s was. The 80s, there's a very clear definition of what the 80s was. The 90s was a very clear definition of what it was. And each of those decades, you go back even throughout the 20th century, they're each marked by a style of dress, by music, by the arts, by movies, and then events that happened in those decades that tend to mark that group of people. When we get to, like, where we are now, where there's such a proliferation of not just information, but of content, that proliferation of content has created like subculture among subculture among subculture. And so, like, for example, I was watching an NBA game the other day. The Bulls, the Chicago Bulls, my favorite team. They were playing in Paris, and there was the number one pick, possibly next year's draft, was there, and I was like, oh, it's cool, it's great. And he was sitting next to some other dude. I don't remember the guy's name. I was like, who's that guy? And why do we care? And I looked him up, and it's like, oh, he's got 125 million followers on TikTok. I was like, oh, that's what people care. I'm not on TikTok. I have no idea, And so thinking about like how then, we've established like these like subcultures, within like the larger culture, and it's like, how do we communicate in that? How do we operate in spaces now where culture seems so fragmented because of the proliferation of content and of opportunities that you have to experience music or whatever it is that you want, based on just kind of the amount that's out there?
Yeah, that's another very challenging question. I think maybe in the first place, it's useful to just ask some questions about the shape of technology in general, because I think for a very long time, we've had a sense, kind of since the Enlightenment, that scientific technological progress will kind of always be a good thing and will lead to better and better societies, better and better lives for people, which, I mean, as we've mentioned, right, a lot of those things have been achieved and realized. And I think especially maybe like in the 60s, and you see some of this language in maybe a document like Gaudium et Spes, where there remains, I mean, even in the church, a kind of optimism about the role that technology will play in the life of man coming into the third millennium. And I think there are a lot more questions being raised now that we have gotten into this age of the internet, about, is technology a good? Is technology sort of a neutral thing, and it can be, is it like any tool that can be used for good or used for ill? Or is it, by kind of the nature it's adopted, become something that is perhaps just dangerous, perhaps just has a bent towards evil outright? I think I still tend to lean towards the idea that it's a tool that can be used for good or bad. I'm delighted that we can have this conversation.
Yeah, we're on the internet right now. We're Zooming, and we're in different states, and we're going to drop this on a podcast that people are going to be listening to on their phones. Yeah, so. Yeah,
but there is, I think, especially in this way that it's not just even, I think, that content and ideas and information gets divided and packaged in so many different ways, but it's feeling more and more like we ourselves are becoming the object of technology, that we ourselves are being grouped and classified and organized in these really sort of troubling ways, that, all these algorithms are sort of constantly working on us. And I think in many ways desiring to lead us away from what we're supposed to be doing, if our desire is to become saints. And so, yeah, I think that much is fairly plain, but I wonder, what do we do with that? And I think in many ways it is creating like good uses of technology, like you're doing. And I think also attending to our sort of more localized communities can be a very helpful thing, which is why I've been so excited about St. Louis the Ninth Society, and about Joie de Vivre, trying to put art in people's churches and trying to put print journals in people's hands in their homes. The technology, I don't know, it remains something that I'm just kind of constantly pondering.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of offering some thoughts there, because I agree. I'm not somebody, I love technology. I love learning about the latest tech, but you did bring up a great point, which was, up to this point, there was always like, yeah, of course, new technology is going to be helpful for us. Hey, the wheel's awesome, right? We got a lot more accomplished because of that thing. Oh, yeah. And there are great inventions throughout the history of man that I think go underrated. Every time I lace up my shoes, I'm like, somebody invented this. Somebody invented laces, and a way of being able to take this and make it wide so I can stick my foot in and then tighten it up. I mean, like, this is These are zippers. This is all stuff's underrated, But we get to like obviously the printing press, and then of course, the phone, electricity. I was talking about like my son with like electricity. I mean, just like the light bulb. I mean, you think about how much that's just completely changed the way we operate as people, is the capacity to have artificial light. And so then the question becomes, well, now what's too much? And I think you're right. I think that the question we have to be asking ourselves, and this of course is what every parent is struggling with their kids, but not just there, but even in our own hearts, we all have to be sensitive about like what we have to be so intentional about what we feed ourselves with, and what our relationship is with technology, what our relationship is with social media, because we can get sucked into a culture that is very much about me, and is very much about there's like a narcissism almost, that's rampant as well,
Right.
which of course would make sense when we talked about the previous creed of, me being the center of the universe type of thing. So I think but that's not to say that it can't be used for good, because it can. I know many people who do wonderful things online and make it as a great life-giving, evangelistic, mission-focused, kind of entity. But I'm not sure if that's not always the case. So, again, thinking about kind of how its role and how it affects culture, how it's shaping culture, it's also shaping language in the way that like my kids talk is different, and the speed upon which that they're processing and speaking to one another, and the words that they're saying. I'm not even sure they all understand what they're saying to each other, because I sure as heck don't always know what they're saying, and I'm not just saying that as like the old guy in the room, but that's just kind of what it is. Hey everybody, this is Dr. Mario Sacasa. We're taking a quick break here from my conversation with Danny to encourage you to check us out at faithandmarriage.org. Let's say you're listening to this episode and you're loving this conversation about beauty, about art, about faith, culture, tradition, and you want to be able to experience a beautiful weekend with your spouse. Then we would love for you to come join us at one of our upcoming marriage retreats. Full list of retreats are available for you at faithandmarriage.org. Again, you will see that many of those retreats are sponsored by a specific parish. Fear not, just put yourself on the waiting list. Often parishes do not fill those retreats up, and they are available for the folks who are on the waiting list. So if you want to have a beautiful, contemplative, prayerful experience with your spouse, then come join us at the beautiful St. Joseph Abbey grounds in Covington, Louisiana. We have wonderful retreats, great speaker couples, awesome food, because it wouldn't be a retreat in Southern Louisiana without delightful food. Anyway, we would love for you just to come to join us. Check us out at faithandmarriage.org. All right. So we think about tradition. We're thinking about culture and its relationship, technology, which is human-made, in the way that we can shape things. Well, like, what role then does art play in this conversation? I mean, how does art influence our faith? How does art influence culture? How does culture influence art? Like, what's art's role in this conversation of tradition, faith, and culture?
Right. Yeah, and maybe to begin with a note, kind of drawing on the question of technology a little bit more. So I've been doing a lot of research lately on the Lord's Day, and how the Lord's Day has kind of vanished as a real firm cultural institution.
Not for Chick-fil-A.
Well, not for Chick-fil-A. That's right. Yeah, the bastion of.
Yes, it's the last stand. The last stand of the Sabbath is Chick-fil-A.
That's right.
I have to admit, anytime I travel on a Sunday, I'm always like, darn it, they're closed on Sunday.
Chick-fil-A.
Come on, Chick-fil-A, just be open for me, man. Can you just make an exception for me?
Desire for profit. Come on. But yeah, I think it's striking that I was looking at some statistics on, like phone usage, screen time, and it seems like most people, on average, are on their phones at least about 3.5 hours a day.
Wow.
Which over the course of a week adds up to about one day. So I think it's very curious that, for many of us, when worship, which I think the Mass is like the pinnacle of culture, and kind of the point where faith and culture and art can really come together. But the fact that we're basically now giving a Lord's day's worth of our time to our phones.
Wow.
Is probably highly indicative of kind of where we are as a culture. Now, I think there are a great many challenges to sort of embracing the Lord's Day and embracing the authentic culture of worship. And I think one of the places where we're often missing out on that is in relation to art. So, for example, um, art has such a capacity to turn us to faith and to help us to worship. But as a culture that is moving more and more towards consumption rather than towards contemplation,
Mm-hmm.
we're becoming less and less equipped, I think, to encounter beauty in art. So, for instance, I teach ninth graders and 11th graders, but sometimes for the ninth graders, like while we're doing some practice grammar exercises, I'll put on some music. And let's say I put some Mozart on. Some of the kids like it, of course, but many of them groan and say, "Mr. Fitzpatrick, please put something else on." And I think we've reached a place where that has kind of become the norm with the relationship between modern culture and art, where there's so much that's available to us to form our senses, right, our sight, our hearing, to form our imaginations and hearts to experience beauty, and ultimately to turn to the liturgy with that sense for the beautiful. But we're being kind of malformed and malnourished in that way. So many of us, perhaps maybe have developed an allergy to Mozart or to
Mm-hmm.
Michelangelo or to so many of these other beautiful things that have made up so much of our tradition that are now kind of alien to us, that we no longer really have very much of the equipment to read and encounter and understand. So I think that's kind of one. I think in many ways that's where we sit with respect to art in our culture, that we don't have that much capacity for it now because we haven't practiced appreciating art, which also translates to, I think, a real lack of creativity in art, which is not to say that it's not out there in the culture. But I think the kind of art that we are producing as a general culture is something that's proceeding from kind of malnourished hearts when it comes to beauty.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm gonna push back on a couple of things here. So
Okay.
tell me what you think,
Excellent.
right? So the first piece is when you talk about like the ninth graders, listening to Mozart. I didn't listen to Mozart when I was in ninth grade, and I probably would have made the same response. Now maybe that's because all I was listening to it was hip hop and hip hop. That's all I was listening to in ninth grade. I was not on my Christian faith, and whatever popular music of the time. And certainly there was a disconnect in that. And so as I've gotten older, I've developed an appreciation for classical music. But I certainly even now don't have that deep appreciation for all the subtleties of all the strings and everything, and so certainly that's something I need to be educated on, which I'm certainly all for. But, how much of that is just an adolescent being like, ugh, like, what the heck, man, why are you putting that on? Which is like indicative of a 13-year-old in 2023, in 2003, in 1993, in 1983. You know what I mean? Like that's just that age,
Right.
In and of itself that groans, to things that kind of came before it. That all of us kind of outgrow a little bit. And so I guess one of my questions is how much of that is just adolescence, period, versus kind of adolescence indicative of this age. And then the other piece is I guess the question about, art, I think, I don't know. I find that because there's such a proliferation of it, maybe it's harder to find it, but I don't know. I still stumble on stuff that is deeply moving, and stuff that really puts its finger kind of right on the pulse of the culture. So for example, the last Disney movie that I saw, was Encanto. I've skipped over the other ones that came out last year. But Encanto had its finger on something, and it kind of flew under the radar when it came out in the movies in the fall of 21. But as soon as it hit Disney Plus, in January of last year, the movie was just like a hit, and like everybody was like singing the songs, and I was like, what the heck? So it's more than just, but I was like, this movie has its finger on something beyond just catchy music. Like Lin-Manuel Miranda is like a genius in terms of his capacity to write music, yes, but this movie as a whole is really touching on something. And I think the themes of the need for family and the need for support, but even more so the need for vulnerability, the need to break free of perfection. Those themes of perfectionism are rampant, in our culture. And so I think when art kind of captures that and flips the story in a way that really we see and we're like, oh my gosh, like I get it. You know what I mean? Like I connect with that. I guess I still think that that's alive and well, in our culture. Now, that isn't to say that it's all like that, for sure. And there's a lot of cynicism and cynical art that you see as well, and kind of a darkness that's present. And maybe I stay away from those shows and those movies because I'm not interested in that anyways. But I know that's very much present as well. Needless to say, about pornography and sexually explicit stuff, no. But just even that darkened kind of violent stuff, that's not there. But I do think that even in where we stand, there does rise moments where you see a piece of art that really puts its finger on the culture and kind of puts a mirror up and says, hey, like this is something worth reflecting on. And I think that's how I would see that relationship, between art and culture, whether it's songwriters, musicians who really kind of get a generation, or whether it's filmmakers who do the same, or painters or sculptors or any of that. I guess I still think that people are doing that and are trying to seek that. But maybe it's a little bit more difficult because of the proliferation of content, like I said earlier. So that's my sense. What do you think?
I agree with that very much. I'm a big Encanto fan. Myself. My son and I were singing some of the songs yesterday morning. So you're exactly right. That film gets at so many things about our culture and presents them just so nicely to the viewer, and it is really pushing on a lot of the notions that are current, that need to be brought forward and expressed and pondered a little more. And I think there are probably many examples of very good art that's being produced. I could think of, like, last year, the Coen brothers made a version of Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth, which I thought was great. There are immense amounts of good that are coming forth.
Do you think that art, though, has to be, for its relationship to faith, has to be religious specifically, or Christian, or in that specific vein? I mean, what do you think about that?
And so I think I would argue that the drive to create good art is always linked to a desire for God. Now, I think very often that's probably not expressed. It's probably not realized on any sort of conscious level. But I think, even from the earliest ages of art, we see a very plain desire. Like when we think about many of the cave paintings, which they're done in these very, like, recessed, difficult to get to places where it's dark. You have to construct scaffolding, and you start to wonder, like, man, like, why did these guys do this? Like, weren't they busy just trying to stay alive? And yet they take the time to descend into the earth, bring lights down there, mix paints, get up on scaffolding, all this stuff. And I think all of that can only really be explained if it speaks to a desire for the transcendent, and for God, which I think we see that desire all over our culture, and there are signs of it everywhere, which to me is, I'm kind of an optimist by nature.
Me too.
So it's always hard for me, like, whenever I say anything about, like, a malformed culture or stuff. That's probably me just being a little dramatic, but for the most part, I do see seeds of beauty and of goodness, kind of all around. I think especially you see it just in interactions with people, right? Which is, I think, always where we have to return to when we're thinking about art and culture as proceeding out of a communal life.
Mm-hmm. Why would you say that those early cave paintings, and I love the way you said that, was beautiful in terms of these are people who were taking time from hunting and gathering and just going into the cave and going deep into these caves to recess parts of the earth to paint pictures of deer and trees. Like why is that, even at that fundamental level, why is that a search for the transcendent? Like why, help me understand that.
So I think the first thing I would say is that it's probably intimately connected on some level with language and
Mm-hmm.
the development of a language that starts to transcend just I don't know, like a transaction between
Mm-hmm.
people,
Mm-hmm.
but is pointing to a deeper reality. So Walker Percy talks about this in many of his books, where you can imagine what it was like to be a few cavemen sitting around a fire, and you in your culture have you've developed this word for elk, right? And you use this word when you're out in the field and you're hunting. You want to indicate to your buddy that, hey, there's an elk over this next rise. You tell him, hey,
Mm-hmm.
elk there. But now you're sitting around the campfire and you start to talk about elk, and everyone realizes, wait, we're not talking about an elk that's right here. We're talking about an imagined elk. We're talking about this concept of elk, that evidently we can still hold in our minds and that has some kind of reality apart from the elk itself. And I think that is probably part of what's at this drive to create, paintings of bulls and horses and elk deep in caves, is this sense that these elk that we see are proceeding from an idea of elkness that transcends all of the individual elk that are out there in the world. To me, that speaks to a deep connection between our words and the life of the word, that we are, having been created through the word, we can use our own words to participate in some way in the life of the divine word. And that, I think that's where part of the initial creative drive proceeds from, is a desire to, through our understanding of concepts which are flowing from sort of the divine abundance, to then sort of like put into being in our own limited way, some echo of that
Mm-hmm.
reality that's been set before us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got you. And I appreciate you sharing that. So, in summary, it's recognizing that elk pre-exists the painting, or that the concept is attached to something that exists beyond it, and that's a very difficult. How do I say this concept? But that's what I want to. It's very challenging in our day and age, where in postmodernism is completely deconstructing of that essence, that elkness. So we will debate the elkness and actually say that there is no elkness, and everybody's interpretation of that elk is individual. But that elk, whether it exists or not in and of itself, it doesn't matter. And that's part of what you were saying earlier in terms of where we started as a culture. I agree with that. I think that's where we've descended to this point where, like, Matt Walsh makes a movie called What is a Woman, and it's super popular. Why? Because the question itself is kind of crazy, but it's where we stand as a culture, that we've deconstructed and are trying to deconstruct all these agreed upon notions, which of course are going to have major ripple effects, in our culture, as we're talking about shared language, shared experience. It's really hard to have shared language and shared experience if everything has to be continually defined, and if we can't have agreement on certain concepts. Like, this thing in front of me is called a microphone. That's what that is, and we all generally agree upon it. We don't have to see it. There it is. And I can leave it in the room. People can come later and they'll still see that that's a microphone. And that's the word that we use in English, to describe this apparatus that's in front of me. And so that deconstruction of language it's funny because it is deeply tied to that postmodern, more relativistic, strict materialism now age, where that's having huge effects on people's psyche and having huge effects on people's mental health and well-being, because people just don't know what it means to be grounded on anything that predates them, because nothing can fundamentally predate you if you are the center of everything.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
there's there's the trade-off. Like that's the
Yes.
way it works. And so people are hungry for that. And
Right.
so it's beautiful. So, okay, that's a great segue here as we're kind of coming to this thing. So with that said, tell us a little bit about SL9, St. Louis, the Ninth Art Society, and the work that you guys are trying to do and taking these concepts and things that we've been speaking about and translating them into very practical and tangible action points. What are those action points, and what are you guys doing?
Sure. So SL9 is, I think it's only in its second year still. So one of these new cultural efforts that will hopefully have lasting effects. But essentially, it grew out of a desire not only to connect a group of artists living in South Louisiana, but especially to put those artists in contact with parishes and other South Louisiana church institutions, where more beauty could really help to raise the mind and heart to God. One of the crises of our time is that we just have a lot of ugly spaces out there, and I think it goes without saying that however ugly the space, if Christ is present there, that it becomes beautiful through Him.
Correct. Right.
But there are so many opportunities, especially when we have so many great artists in this region and across the country, and so many churches filled with people who are hungry for beauty. So the society has basically been able to bring this community together, and to not only identify specific church and artist sort of collaborations, but also to raise the funds so that these churches, especially the ones that are sort of under-resourced, can be able to commission those works from the artists, and help to beautify their spaces, and really help to, in many cases, help to tell the story of the parish or school or wherever else it might be. So, for example, one of our artists, Blair Pierce, right now, she's done many works for the society so far, including the cover image for our first issue of Joie de Vivre. But she is working on a commission right now for a South Louisiana parish that has a large African American population, and so she's doing a large oil painting right now of the scene of Saint Philip baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. Wow. And so that is going to be, a commission that I think really hopefully speaks to the people of the parish, and helps to tell their story, both at kind of a local level, but also their story within the life of the church. So the society is doing a lot of work in those kind of respects, like bringing artists together with communities who can really celebrate the artwork itself, and use that artwork as a means to grow closer to God, and to embrace their own tradition at a higher level. We also then, of course, have Joie de Vivre, which is kind of an offshoot from SL9, to help celebrate the work of the artists, but also to help tell the story of Catholicism in South Louisiana, and to connect our sort of local culture with experts and artists from around the world who are interested in it and want to continue to contribute to it.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, I love what you just said with regards to art and tying it to local culture. Again, kind of what we talked about with Encanto, doing that in a broader context, or other songs that kind of hit that kind of threshold. That's what you're accomplishing, at the most local level, which I think is really beautiful. So even the cover art is of a very young Saint Joan of Arc, which was commissioned by Saint Joan of Arc Parish in Laplace. And so in a community that was just hit hard by Hurricane Ida, not too long ago. And so, like, to commission art like that, it has its space to be able to bring a community together and to now say, now we have this new rendering of how we can reflect and think about Saint Joan of Arc. And it is a beautiful image. She's not in her traditional kind of armor and, ready to go to battle is how we usually see her. She's very peasant-like, and very humble in that sense. And so it gives a different interpretation of her that helps us to be able to see that. Now, for a local parish that's named in her honor, then you can reflect on that and say, well, what impact does that have on our community? For us to reflect on what this image means. Similarly, you're talking about with the other piece of art that she's doing for that predominantly African-American parish, which is then to show Philip, baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch, to remind that there is a one baptism, and to show and have representation of African-Americans that wasn't African-American, but he was an African in art, people of darker skin tone. And I know that's something that Father Josh Johnson has tried at his parishes to make sure that he has the saints represented across cultures. And so he's very intentional about making sure that the images that he puts up go across all the cultures so that anybody who walks through that door can look up at one of the saints and say, that person looks like me. And there's something to that encourages me to be able to live this life. And so again, that's how we see, again, back to this kind of relationship at the most local level of how art can inspire us and can help us to live those ideals that are embodied, in that piece of art. And so beautiful to be able to see that, certainly in a Catholic context, very much with the churches there. So with the journal, though, is the journal something that you guys see being tied to Louisiana, and obviously that as a means to be able to raise awareness and about what St. Louis SL9 is doing? What role does the journal play, I guess, with this other piece of connecting artists with parishes?
Yeah, so I think as far as its relation to SL9, the key thing in that regard is just giving many of our artists sort of a wider platform.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them, of course, have very wide platforms already, and would be just fine on their own. But it still is a way to, especially try to just allow just sort of regular parishioners to be able to pick up this journal, to be able to flip through and see some of the beautiful art that many of our local artists are creating. Now, of course, it's not simply a journal of visual art.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I'm most excited about with the journal is that I think we really have something for everyone in each issue. So we have essays, like we have Dr. Haddad's essay on culture as embodied religion. We have an essay by Dr. Chris Baglow on Walker Percy and science. We have an essay by Father Clinton Sensat on basically Christ and stories, and how stories are so intimately related to Christ's saving work. We have poetry, we have short fiction, we have an interview with one of our artists.
Your piece in there. You have a small short fiction piece in there.
A short story in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have something for everyone in the journal, which I'm just delighted about. I've been so excited just with the variety of writers and artists that we've been able to bring together. And I think I think that is going to continue to grow. So for instance, for our June issue, we were really excited to get, we have an essay in it from former LSU head baseball coach Paul Maneri, about sort of his experience of faith and baseball, and how his Catholic faith has informed his life as a coach, and how being a baseball coach has really informed his Catholic faith. And so we're going to have a lot of things like that where, we're planning to cover so many of the things that are crucial to South Louisiana culture. So whether it's like things we were mentioning earlier, Saints football, Mardi Gras, we're gonna get into some fishing and hunting, hopefully in our fall and winter issues. And so I think there's going to be a huge range there, for everyone from, somebody who loves baseball and Saints football, to people who are interested in, high fine art, and those who love poetry, those who are interested in philosophy and literature. So I'm just very excited about the blend of all those things coming together in one place.
That sounds great. Yeah, that really does. So praise the Lord. Well, many blessings to you guys and the work that you're doing. I think, yeah, you're right. It does offer something unique. And I know there's a lot of different movements trying to push more beauty into the church. And even in Southern Louisiana, we have something like the Vigil Project, which is attacking it from a music standpoint. I think what you guys are doing is different in that it's more the visual arts, more than music specifically. Although of course there's obviously connection between all of that for sure, but just the fact that like there is a desire to want to bring, like a reminder that art isn't just, it isn't just abstract, but that abstraction means something more, and that there's something that beauty does point us, towards the Lord, and that we do need beautiful spaces in our homes and in our places of worship, because those things do bring a sense of rest, but also, of course, bring us into a greater connection with the divine. So praise the Lord, for the work that you guys are doing and the mission that you have going forward. So if people are interested in picking up the journal or buying the journal or becoming a member of the society, how can they do that? What's the process of that? Where would be the good place to go to get more information about it?
So jdvjournal.com is our website, and there people can find subscription information as well as information on how to submit. If there's anyone who'd like to submit short stories, poetry, essays, visual art, any of that, we're very happy to review. They can also find, we do have weekly online works so essays, poetry, kind of the whole gamut once again, that we're posting there as well. So that would be the best resource, is just jdvjournal.com. There's also SL9 has its own website, which can easily be found by just searching.
I'll have links to it. I'll have links to it on the show notes.
Excellent.
So we'll have links to both of those. That's great. So that way people can access that. And if maybe somebody listening says, hey, I have an idea for an article or for an essay or for a creative piece, that if you listener have a creative piece that you've been holding on to and you have a poem that's been tucked away in some folder buried deep within your computer, hey, my encouragement to you is to pull it up, dust it up, email it, and please, get it out there. Yeah. And you just never know how it's going to land. I think so often when it comes to art, we feel very vulnerable with the process and are feel very subjected to rejection, by putting ourselves out there. And I've learned over the years, and I say this as encouragement to anybody who that might be, that situation, just let it go, and do your best and put it out there and just see where it lands. And I assure you that you'll be better for taking the risk. You'll be better for it, for taking the risk, and it will encourage you. So a little word of encouragement to anybody who needed that. All right, Danny. Well, final question I ask all my first-time guests: what gives you hope?
Above all, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist gives me hope. The fact that we get to be part of a church that has endured through so many difficult ages, and the way that the Eucharistic life of the Lord is embodied in so many people around us all the time, is just a constant joy for me and a constant reminder to be hopeful.
Amen. Beautiful. Yes, Jesus is with us. Incarnate himself. He never left us. Grateful for the Eucharist that always is present there, and the community that surrounds it, the people of God, that we are a Eucharistic people, a people of praise, a people of thanksgiving, and being able to remind ourselves and others of that, I firmly believe is a very hopeful vision to hold on to. So thank you for sharing that for us. So Danny, blessings to you and the work that you're doing both at Jesuit and with SL9. God bless you and your family. And thanks, man, for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you so much, Mario. It's been great to be here.
Well, folks, that does it for this conversation with Danny. And I love episodes like this where we can kind of get a little heady and have some intellectual debates and discussion about culture and art and faith and tradition, how these things all kind of shape us. I want you listeners to be smart consumers of the media that you ingest, whether it's TV shows or books that you're reading or music that you're listening to. I pray that episodes like this are helpful to you to be able to think about the stuff that you are listening to, or the stuff that's capturing your imagination. See, when we watch certain movies or we listen to certain songs, those lyrics, those scenes, they get stuck in our heads and we start thinking about them. And so the question becomes, what are we allowing to feed our imagination? What are we allowing to feed our conscience? And I'm not saying that everything you need to listen to has to be religious in context. Not at all. As I stated earlier, there are some gems within pop culture, but we have to be smart consumers of what that stuff is so that we can form our conscience and form our imagination in ways that God wants us to. So if you have any comments, please leave them for me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn at Dr. Mario Sacasa. I thank you guys for hanging in all the way to the end of this episode. Many blessings to you today. However this episode has found you, I pray that you are having a wonderful day. And if not, may the Lord grant you peace and may the Lord give you hope to endure whatever it is that you're going through. So many blessings to you, dear listener. So grateful for each and every single one of you. Know that we pray for you and have yourselves a wonderful day.